we decided today, after the invite from Alex, to try and do a two-hander in the time we've got available. And so we're going to do a swap over halfway through. We're both from Newcastle University. We work in a place called the Culture Lab, which is a cross-faculty institution at Newcastle University, owned by the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, but occupied by a range of projects and people from different research groups. So we're from the Faculty of Science, the School of Computing, and part of what's called the Digital Interaction Group. But there's also a digital media research group, performing arts, and various things goes on in Culture Lab. So it's a very interesting interdisciplinary environment. And we've got a range of projects running at the moment. Let's see what's on the next slide. That involve the design and design, development and deployment of new digital technologies. And so we're quite interested from a research point of view about how we design innovative digital technologies, but also we're interested in the making and the use of these digital technologies. And where does storytelling come into all of this? We want to tell you our talk in two parts. We want to tell you about the way in which we've been using storytelling as a way to understand how to design better, more meaningful things for people. But also we want to show you some of the technologies that we've made and developed and deployed, which help people create, to share digital stories. I'm going to do the first bit, the power of stories in experience-centered design. I'll tell you a little bit about that. How we can use stories to understand people's experiences and how we can help them to imagine future technologies and future use through storytelling and through story sharing. And Rachel's going to talk about a range of different digital media we've designed and developed that provide people with tools for storytelling. I think that's one. So my research interest is what's called human-centered design, where the basic questions that drive that research is the need, if we're going to provide meaningful, usable and useful digital or any kinds of products or services, the need that there is to understand what the real end users of those technologies are really like. And we've all experienced the horrors of technologies which are difficult to use, difficult to understand, and difficult to build into our everyday lives. So the point of human-centered design is to try and think about how we can improve that situation. So what are our real end users like? What's the experience of our products or services that we build? And are they useful and usable and meaningful to people? And you can imagine the problems talking to designers, software engineers about end users, and you say, well, we want to design a new application for a mobile phone user or something like that. And immediately everyone imagines what they think the typical mobile phone user is. And they probably don't think of someone like that. So the whole issue is, how do we get to understand people's experiences of technology and experiences of use in the real world, in the real use context? What's the next one?
Your book.
Oh yeah. So when we were trying to think about how do we go about engaging with felt life, the lived experience of people, what kind of tools are available? Should we give people surveys? Should we do some kind of psychological experiments? I'm a psychologist by background, actually. Where we arrived at is, actually there's it's not actually a quote from Bakhtin, and that's slightly great. The idea from the literary theorist and philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, that actually the novel might be the most sophisticated tool that we've thought or developed, people have developed in order to understand and to see people's experiences. And of course, in my discipline of psychology, there's a whole lot of work around the self, narrative, the role of stories, the role of narrative in in understanding the human condition, and in social sciences, the whole process of narrative inquiry. So we began to explore this idea that engaging in people's experiences might be about sharing, creating, constructing and working with stories. I'm just going to show you one way in which we've kind of put this into play in a kind of design situation, and it's a health situation to kind of respond to the brief we were given. So I've done quite a bit of work at Sheffield University, which is where I was before I came to Newcastle, around the idea of how to improve health services. These are not particularly digital examples. We'll show you some digital examples of things later. But one of the things that we're committed to is the idea that in order to design better things, we have to involve those designers in the process. And in Sheffield, we were involved with a project, and we are still involved with a project in the local hospital, where we were given the brief of helping them improve the experience of outpatient services for older people. And we used this, an approach. We were interested in using an approach called experience-based design, which had been developed by some other researchers to understand that. And you'll see why I'm taking a while to explain this in a minute. But the idea behind experience-based design is that it starts with understanding the patient's stories of the services, the stories, getting them to give stories around their experiences of the services that they use. And we do the same as well with the staff. So the people who deliver these services, what's their daily life like? What does it feel like to be on the front line of the outpatient services on a daily basis? So we gathered a whole range of stories, and then in the process we bring those groups of people together in a series of shared learning, story sharing workshops, where we get the patients and the staff each to talk about their stories. And from there we use that to identify a series of improvements that we might make. So let's go on to the next one. Take a long time to explain. These stories were actually quite moving. They're not, the really well constructed, well crafted stories that Pip was talking about. These are just us asking people, what's your worst experience of the outpatient service? And this is one of the patients who, because of parking problems outside, had to be dropped off by her daughter, who then had to go somewhere else to park the car. And it transpired that then, as she was trying to get into the hospital, she fell over. And that tells you kind of an interesting story about some of the problems that people have with the service. But it wasn't until actually we took that story into the participatory design workshops and we began to engage in a dialogue around those kinds of stories that we began to get a fuller picture. We got very interesting stories from the staff, from the porters. Turns out porters can't help someone when they've fallen down on the street, because that violates their insurance or whatever. So that's why she ended up getting picked up by a passerby and an ambulance driver. And the whole kind of that sharing of experiences then brought together a whole set of issues which were quite complex. And we used those stories then to plot a kind of journey through the outpatient's visit, from receiving the letter that invites you to come to an appointment right through to seeing the doctor and leaving at the end. And we mapped those stories onto parts of this journey, and we mapped parts of the fragments of the stories onto whether or not it was a positive experience or a negative experience. And in that process of kind of sharing the stories and thinking about the stories, we were able to identify a series of issues that we wanted to change through design. I can't remember what the next slide is. Okay. One of the interesting, so that's kind of one way in which we've used stories as part of the design process. And what we found from that experience was that the stories were very powerful. They were a very easy way to help people engage in dialogue. There were kind of a lot of political, ethical, quite charged issues when the two different groups, the staff and the patients, came together, which had to be negotiated and so on. when we moved to the design phase, one of the problems that we had was actually it's very difficult. It's very easy to get people to tell stories of their actual experiences that they've had, but trying to move them into a situation where they're thinking about possible futures, possible worlds, possible changes that they could make, imagining how it could be different, that was quite difficult, particularly for patients, particularly for maybe older people. And there's a whole set of other techniques then that we've, not in that project, but we've developed as a process, as a response to that problem, where we're using stories to help people not understand the past or understand their previous experiences, but to imagine possible experiences. And this is work that we've done with Professor Pam Briggs at Northumbria University. And this is a kind of video scenario in which we try to produce an evocative story around a potential design that we thought might be of interest to the user group that we were working with, but we never showed them that design. The point was we wanted to engage their imaginations in what this could possibly be, and then we would enter into a kind of participatory co-design dialogue with them around, okay, so if we actually built this thing, what would it actually look like?
What's that then? What's what? That there. That's my biometric demon. What's that then? Well, it's a demon that's biometric. Right. What's all that about then? Well, it's an entity comprised, with all my personal biometric data on it. Right. It's an entity sustained by and comprised of my biometric data. Oh, right.
You can see how it might go on, but it's kind of interesting, it's kind of slightly comical, engages the imagination in ways, and what the project was about was actually working with older people around security and password identity and trying to think of how we might design something that would give them better access to or better ways of navigating security issues around the internet. Okay, so what's the next one? That's yours. Okay, so what I've done there is try to kind of give you a sense or a feel for the way in which we've kind of tried to use stories to help people share their experiences of technology, of services, and also ways in which we've used stories to imagine possible technologies as a way of kind of engaging imaginatively and evocatively users and designers together in dialogue. What Rachel's going to tell you about now, all of the things here actually, most of the things here have been designed through this kind of strongly participatory process, but actually these things are about in themselves stories and the way in which digital media can be used to collect, gather and share stories, and she'll tell you about that side.